SUERF, the European Money and Finance Forum, bringing together policymakers, finance, and academia.
Welcome to this SUERF-Baffi Bocconi e-lecture on COVID-19 and climate transition, the role of creative destruction. While in many ways fundamentally different types of shocks, both the COVID-19 pandemic and climate change have in common that they are shocks fundamental enough to trigger substantial changes in behavior and economic policies. The implied required fundamental structural changes to the way our economies work raise the issue of the role of creative destruction. What role will or should creative destruction play in overcoming these shocks? How to encourage and facilitate creative destruction while cushioning its social costs? Which measures to take to even benefit from creative destruction and creative rebuilding necessitated by COVID-19 and by climate transition? Building upon his new book, The Power of Creative Destruction, which I can recommend to all of you, Philippe Aghion from Harvard University will present his answers to these questions. Thomas Philippon from New York's NYU Stern and Şebnem Kalemli-Ozcan, University of Maryland, will discuss Philippe's analysis and add their own perspectives. The event will be moderated by Natacha Valla, Dean of SciencesPo. Without further ado, I hand over to you, Natacha.
Thank you very much, Ernest. Thank you very much to all the audience who is here today to listen to our event, our SUERF event, on this very topical topic, I should say, of COVID and climate transition, the role of creative destruction. You've heard Ernest giving the overall idea we had when we put together the speakers we have today. We really want to have the common theme of creative destruction because we believe we have seen those two big shocks, those two massive global shocks, and the occurrence of such shocks together trigger dynamics that not always match, the dynamics we see when we see, a set of idiosyncratic shocks or country-specific shocks, and we want to understand how that affects productivity, how that affects the dynamics of the corporate sector, and therefore we thought it would be interesting to have our three speakers interact on this topic. I'm only the moderator, so I will take as little time as possible between their presentation and your questions. So let me start. Ernest has introduced them. They are very famous in any case, so I don't need to say more. I will first give the floor to you, Philippe. So that's Philippe Aghion, professor at Collège de France and at the LSE, to start with a few remarks. I will then give the floor to Şebnem and finally to you, Thomas.
Great. Thanks so much, Natacha. Thanks so much to all of you for being there. Ernest, Thomas, Şebnem. It's true that both the climate and the COVID, put creative destruction more than ever on the forefront. On climate, there were some proponents in France who believed that the solution to the climate problem is to have negative growth, la décroissance, as we say in French. Although we have a natural experiment because during the first lockdown, during the 3 months of the first lockdown from March to June, I think GDP in France went down 30%, but CO2 emissions went down only 8%. And it's clear that, in order to solve, to overcome the climate problem, you can't avoid green innovation. The problem with green innovation is the path dependence problem, which we identified in work with Daron Acemoglu, David Emus, Ralph Martin, John Van Reenen, is that existing firms that tend to innovate in combustion engines in the past or in polluting technologies in the past tend to continue innovating in polluting technologies in the future. They don't spontaneously shift to innovating into green. So there is a role that you need to redirect. So of course, this first implies that creative destruction should help you because new firms do not face the path dependence problem, okay, as much as existing firms. So creative destruction is part of the solution, in fact, right away when you push, when you show the extent of this path dependence problem. Then the thing is that you need policy to redirect technical change. And you have several, policy tools. And Thomas was with me in the Blanchard-Tirol Commission, who, wrote a report for Emmanuel Macron, and a big part of the report was on climate. And of course, clearly there is a role for carbon tax, carbon price. There is also a role for, R&D investment and more generally industrial policy. And there is a role for civil society. And I will get back to that. Now, the thing with climate is that the European Commission, as well explained by Pisani in a recent paper that he did for the Peterson Institute, the European Commission recently introduced plans for cutting CO2 emission by 55% by 2030 instead of 40%. The UK government has announced that all new cars will need to be zero emission by 2035. And you have now various auto industry manufacturers that plan to replace combustion engine cars with vehicles based on which are not combustion engine, not even hybrids. For example, Audi will stop releasing any model with combustion engine or hybrid by 2026. So this implies that you will have destruction of existing physical capital, you will have plant closing, you will have patents that embody combustion engines innovation that will lose value, and there will be massive labor reallocation from combustion engines factories to, factories producing cars with electric vehicles, and that's for cars, but it's more generally for. So there is, of course, that bears the question: what should be the optimal speed of the transition? If you go too slowly, it will force you to be much more drastic tomorrow. But on the other hand, can you be abrupt and do everything nowadays? So there is the whole issue of the speed of the energy transition. And there is the issue of the role of the state, of the role of public spending, of public debt, of investment. And I'll get back to that. Okay, so that's for the climate part. The COVID also has to do with creative destruction. Obviously, and that was a very nice article, written by Barry Eichengreen on that last year, pointing out how much the retail sector will utilize AI and automation more than ever, because consumers will not give up the habit of ordering online post-COVID. Lockdown revealed the virtues of remote working and video conferences. We will not go back to where we were before. And we also got used to medical consultations by phone and video. So there are things that will durably change. And again, there is a role for policymakers. How much should be protection? How much reallocation? You don't want to completely protect, and as we say in French, mettre l'économie sous cloche, because you need the creative destruction to operate. Also, we know that the COVID revealed the extent of disindustrialization and in Europe and in France in particular, and we know that to regain control of value chains will also entail entry of new firms, replacing old firms. And there is very interesting work by Pisani, Blanchard, and Thomas, trying to understand how will you deal, with some firms will need to disappear, and you will have to make sure that workers and entrepreneurs are reallocated, and some firms will have to be continued. So how can the state play a role as a partner to banks and to other lenders to make sure that you don't go too far in destroying existing activities, but on the other hand, you allow for good creative destruction to operate. And I don't want to, I think I already exhausted my time, but in fact, you want to, I have 1 minute left. Essentially, my last thing I want to say is that the climate and the COVID call for a capitalism which is innovative. We need to be more innovative in Europe, but also greener and more protective. In particular, the US needs to be more protective capitalism, but we also need to be greener. How can we be more innovative, but also greener and more protective? And I think there are two ideas that I want to say to conclude. I believe in the centrality of the triangle between firms, the state, and civil society. Whether you talk about green innovation, firms innovate green, but the state can implement the tax, the carbon tax or the industrial policy. But there is a big role for civil society, consumers, shareholders, the work of Hart and Zingales, green finance. So you have a role for this triangle to state and firms are not enough. Civil society also has a big role to play to induce green innovation. And I want to, it's true for flex security system. You want to make growth both more innovative and more inclusive. Well, the Danish flex security is a big success because it makes creative destruction in Denmark work better, but also it makes Denmark a more protective model. And that was achieved through the contracts between firms, the state and individuals. And my final word is that we will need to rethink Maastricht, the Maastricht Treaty. I think Draghi, because I'm in Italy, let me pay tribute to Mario Draghi. Very smart of Mario Draghi to use the European funds to borrow further and to invest in education, in in key sectors, in research. I think there is need to make Europe needs to invest more, but you need to look at the governance and performance of those investments. So I am in favor of not putting on the same footing growth enhancing investment that will increase the G, and investment that are not growth enhancing. And so it's very important to look at the composition of public spending and the governance of the public spending to make sure they're really used to increase, to foster growth, be it education, be it industrial policy, be it research, and also greener growth. And I think that's a new way to use Maastricht. I'm not in favor of doing away with Maastricht, but we should change the way of operating the Maastricht Treaty. And I stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Philippe. That was very comprehensive view. Şebnem, I give you the floor.
Thank you so much, Natacha. It's a pleasure to be here in this very distinguished panel and speakers. Let me start by emphasizing the role of finance in all these things. We use this word all the time. Philippe just talked about green finance, but when you start thinking about how this works and the whole granularity and everything, it is actually pretty complex and pretty complicated. So as Philippe said, we just cannot expect everything from government. Government just cannot do everything. This triangle is important, how government, financial sector, private sector all interacts. And there's a key role of finance to be played here. In the COVID context, I think this just became absolutely clear. So COVID is not an idiosyncratic shock, as you said, Natacha, but it is in a sense a very uneven shock. It is a global shock. It just hit everyone, but it's very uneven. It's uneven by sectors. It's uneven by firms, and the policy response to COVID and where firms started made the outcome even more even. So just think about this. You start with a shock that hits the services sectors way more than sectors like utilities, for example. You start with a shock that hits poor way more than the rich. You start with a shock that hits small firms that just live day to day with cash and revenue and don't have large credit lines way more than something like an airline, a large firm, right? And you start with a shock like that, and then you do a tremendous stimulus, both on the monetary side and the fiscal side, policies that's supposed to work for the aggregate economy, right? I mean, these are not the policies that we can say, oh, let me cut the interest rate for the restaurants and not for the manufacturing firms, right? We can't say that. Or you don't say, oh, let me just send my checks to the people who work in restaurants and not the people who work in universities, like we are. So the policies weren't like that. The policies were very much done for the whole economy, for a shock that is very uneven. So where we are right now, is definitely a better place. Definitely a better place, because thank God we did have the policies, and of course we have the vaccine. That's very important. But I would like to highlight how the uneven nature of the shock and these policies that targets the aggregate economy and the finance interacts. So since the start of COVID, we did basically 3 papers. We are a team of myself, Purely Vigonsha, Veronica Penchowaka, and Nick Sender. Originally last year, we wrote a paper titled COVID and SME Failures. And this paper shows clearly how vulnerable SMEs, small, medium enterprises are, because they fail when they are in this cash crunch, right? They have a liquidity problem, they don't have the revenues. Restaurant would be a typical example here. So they fail, right? So, and then we measure that. I mean, there were a lot of theory work talking about this and how the intervention should be, like very influential work by Thomas here. So we said, okay, there are all these great ideas. Let's just go and quantify, measure in the data what is going on. We rely a lot to European firms. We have other countries to emerging markets, but we rely a lot to European firms for two reasons. A, SMEs are, lifeline in Europe. SMEs account more than 65% of employment, aggregate output, and investment in Europe. These are the firms defined as firms with less than 250 employees. This is not an airline that can draw in a credit line, okay? So we are talking about different firms, but these are the firms if we want to understand unemployment, if we want to understand investment, if we want to understand growth. So if you look at what is going on with these firms, then we realize in the absence of policy intervention, a large bulk would have failed. But of course, policy intervention saved the day, especially in Europe, because there were a lot of policies that were directly targeted to these firms, right? I mean, firms less than 250 employees got pandemic loans, got cash grants, waivers. I mean, countries like Germany stopped moratoriums by law. So basically, that's what we quantified in the original paper. Then in the second paper that was forthcoming in American Economic Review Papers and Proceedings, titled Time Bomb, we said, okay, what is going to happen in 2021? We did all these things in 2020. What is going to happen in 2021? Do we have a time bomb in our hands? Did we overdo the policy? In that paper, we showed that actually not necessarily. Yes, policy was huge. Yes, it was untargeted, but at the end of the day, it didn't turn out that once policy support withdrawn, we are going to have this like wall of bankruptcy. So we showed that this is not the case for 2021 low time bomb. And the final piece we did, the same team, is the Jackson Hole paper just presented a couple of weeks ago. Now we add fiscal policy to this mix. Originally, we only look at the policies that target firms, and we look at it in a global sense. We said, okay, we had all these policies targeting SMEs, but at the same time, we have the broad fiscal policy package that involves, checks, stimulus checks, other transfers. So let's add to that. Let's add a global picture with IO linkages, input-output linkages, because these firms don't operate in silo, in nowhere, right? I mean, we hear all the time the supply chain issues, bottlenecks, how demand normalized and supply still constrained, and we have all these problems, which is reflected, of course, in prices and inflation. So we add all this to our original framework, and this is our Jackson Hole paper that look at the fiscal policy in terms of helping, firms in a global sense, and how these linkages across firms, IO linkages, help that, amplify that, or downplay that. Like, how does this work? And the key conclusion from that, actually very interesting. Our title is, Does Fiscal Policy Get in All the Cracks? So we borrow this title from the famous quote of Jeremy Stein on the monetary policy. We find that actually fiscal policy did get in all the cracks in a domestic economy. So say US did trillions of stimulus in fiscal that helped US firms, US SMEs, and corporate sector. If this is done in Europe, that helped theirs. So domestically, great. But globally, actually, we find negative spillovers. So this whole notion that was pushed a lot at some point, I think especially by OECD, this is great, US is spending all this money, this is going to lift all the boats, this tide will lift all the boats. Not true, actually. We don't find that result, and that's especially because of the two things, IO linkages, right? The nature of this shock, the uneven nature of this shock. This shock is not hitting all the sectors at the same time, and demand and supply normalization is not at the same time. So just the fact that US spends a lot, ECP, Europe spends a lot, and then demand is high, and this is going to be good for everyone. This is a very kind of a traditional way of thinking and doesn't apply with such an uneven shock and with such different policies. Let me stop here and I can answer more questions when I have. Thank you.
Thank you, Şebnem. That's a very clear message. I give the floor now to Thomas. Thomas.
Thank you. in my 5 minutes, I just want to put down a few facts about creative destruction. So this is for the US, by the way, just because I think some of them are going to become relevant when we think about the transition, either COVID or climate. So the first is this idea that creative destruction has somewhat decreased over the past 20 years. Oftentimes people show growth business formation, like the number of firms that are created. The issue with that measure has been shown by some research by people at MIT, is that, you know, when you say there are fewer new firms being created, that's true. That's for sure is true in the US. The problem is you don't know which ones are not being, where is the decrease coming from? If it's only the small firms that didn't really have a prospect to grow that are not being created, then maybe it's not such a big deal. In other words, if we keep producing the disruptive firms that can essentially challenge the big firms later on, then maybe the fact that there are fewer firms being created is not such a big deal. So instead of looking at the creation, I look at the disruption here. But you see the graph looks somewhat similar. So this measure here is the opposite, is 1 minus the correlation of ranks over 5 years windows. So what you do is pretty simple. You just take the top firms for each industry, or even all the firms from the CompuStat database. So it's the big firms, of course. And you compute the rank of the firms in the industry in year T, and then you do the same thing in year T plus 5, and then you look at the correlation of the rank. So if the correlation is 1, that means that the ranking has been frozen for 5 years. Number 1 is still number 1, number 2 is still number 2, number 3 is still number 3. So that would be a correlation of 1. And here, this is showing you 1 minus the correlation, the part that's changing. And so you can see that the changing was about 12% on a 5-year period in the 80s, up to maybe like 14% in the 90s. And now it's decreased a lot, essentially divided by 2. So that's kind of a sign that there is less reshuffling of large firms at the top of their industry. The next slide is going to show you the same thing with a different measure. So this is to some extent even simpler. This is just looking at the top companies. So this is typically done with the S&P 500, or you could do it with the top 100. And this is just counting the fraction of firms that have been at the top for the past 10 years. Okay, so if you look at the data for 2000, you see that if you look at the top 100 firms in 2000, only 45 of them had been in the top 100 for the past 10 years. That is from 1990 to 2000. But if you look at the recent data, it's around 70%. Okay, which means that if you look at the data from 2019 and you look at the top 100 firms in 2019, it's more than 71% of them had been in the top 10 for the last 10 years. Okay. So again, you see the same thing, and the transition happened somewhere in the 2000s. That's when it started to go up here. So that's the sense in which at the top there is less creative discretion. There is less reshuffling of the leaders. Depending, it doesn't really matter how you measure it. You see that. And that's the first thing to keep in mind, which is that we've known for a long time that the decrease in business formation in the US, which probably starts somewhere in the 80s, is clear in the data. But this is showing that now we can even say that for that or for other reasons, this has led to less reshuffling of top firms within their industry. The last slide I want to show you is about the allocation in the cross-section. So the previous fact will show you just that, okay, essentially it looks like the rankings of firms has become more frozen over time. This is showing that something slightly different, a bit more advanced, which is, okay, in a well-functioning market economy where creative destruction is efficient, then there should be something like a queue theory of entry, okay, which is that if you rank industries by their Tobin's Q or other measures of profitability, then ideally you would like to see more net entry in industries where profits or market values are high. Okay, That's kind of the intuitive sense in which, if that happens mechanically, that means that the system is self-correcting. It means that if you have excess profit margin in one industry, then there's going to be more entry in that industry. And then over time, the profit margin are going to go down. And vice versa, if an industry is struggling, then you're going to have net exit. Okay. So a simple way to look at it is look at the elasticity of the net growth rate of firms to Tobin skew. Okay. So this is over I think the 3-year period, so from T to T plus 2. So we just look at the growth rate from T to T plus 2, and we see the covariance of the growth rate, if you want, with Tobin skew at time T. So if that thing is positive, that means that if an industry has higher Tobin skew, it's going to experience higher net entry over the following 2 or 3 years. And as you can see, that number was clearly positive, around 0.5 until the late 90s. In terms of balance, now of course, if you translate that into units that are easier to understand, that means that if an industry has a 10% higher profit margin or Tobin skew, then you're going to see 5% higher growth rate of firms. If you translate that into how long does it take for the profit margin to be corrected by entry, something like 5 to 10 years. Okay, so it's not super fast. It's not as if you make money and the next year it's gone. Okay, it takes maybe 5 or 10 years to that would be the half-life, the persistence of your excess profit. But it's been rebalanced since the 2000s. However, you see that this number is essentially 0. What this is telling you is that entry in the cross-section has become uncorrelated with excess values. So that's a problem, because if the market can send you a signal that an industry makes a lot of money, then it would be efficient to reallocate more, especially more new firms to that industry. But this is not really what we see. So this suggests that something else is going on in the background, and at least one possible explanation is increasing barriers to entry. So if what's driving the creative discussion process is not so much the market price, which is telling you, okay, there is a good investment opportunity, you should get there. That's one dimension. But the other dimension is how good are the incumbents are preventing entry. If that's the variable that matters, then that variable by itself would create a negative correlation. And what this is telling you is that in the past 20 years, it looks like the market signal for entry and the strength of incumbent at preventing entry more or less cancel each other, so that at the end of the day, we get something close to 0, which is not very good news for reallocation. Okay, so I think that's the background. And then I think these facts are important when we're going to think about for the future or for the green transition in particular. Thank you.
Thank you, Thomas. It was a set of very tangible results. And I think the 3 presentations were very complementary, because we really started with an overview of the main key issues. Şebnem gave some results, in particular on the SMEs, and we'll come back to that. And you're giving a view on the market structure, basically, and the evolution of the population of firms. So I'd like to organize the hour that we've left now by doing first another round of little interventions by the 3 of you. I'll have a question which will also give you the opportunity to react to what the others have said. And then I'm saying that for the audience, in a bit less than half an hour, you'll get the opportunity to send your questions. Please use the chat function, which is at the bottom right of your screen, to communicate the questions, and I will moderate the dialogue. So Philippe, maybe in light of the view of what we've heard basically from Şebnem, who said, we have a global shock, but with an uneven, very uneven effect, very heterogeneous effect, depending on the agents. The untargeted policy was okay. Şebnem, you correct me if I got your messages wrong, but that fiscal policy was really necessary overall to get all the cracks, basically. Thomas telling us that in the background of those 2 major shocks that we're looking at today, we have very fundamental market structure story where the distribution of incumbents is in fact very static, and that incumbents seem to have managed to prevent entry and competition over time. The question is, how will those 2 shocks combined affect this power of incumbents, in a sense, or the competitive structure of markets on the corporate sector. Now, can we model those two shocks together and the interaction of those two shocks to see the effect on creative destruction, market structure, idleness in the distribution, and the effectiveness of policies? It's a bit of a long question, but feel free also to address everything else that has been dealt with so far. Philippe.
Yeah, so that's not that's well, a lot in what you ask. They are not of the same nature. The climate challenge is not a shock in the same sense as the COVID. COVID was really a shock. It first, forced some firms to close down and some activities to stop. And that induced had demand effects. So you had a kind of first order effect of, supply stopping. Like some activities had to stop. Because people could not go to work, because some number of stores had to close, or airlines had to close, and that induced a demand shock. So, so Olivier, for example, has described that very well. Olivier Blanchard, and he always has new versions of his textbook, and he has a chapter on COVID. He describes very well, how the shock. It's a supply shock that induces a demand shock, and then you react. So the COVID, it's a shock. You had to react to the shock in short run, but it's also a shock that revealed deeper problems. So COVID, it's both how you react to the shock. So there were questions, the French government, for example, decided to protect, firms and consumers. Other governments did differently. And then you had the issue of what does it reveal? So it also revealed in a longer term in France in particular, but also in other European countries, inadequate innovation ecosystem. We realized we were not able to produce vaccines as well as the US. Even you have a German firm who had to, who needed BARDA, and he needed the US to develop the Pfizer vaccine. So, so you see, so that's COVID. You see, COVID is that kind of thing. So you have the short run, the reacting to the, to the fact that some firms, many firms, you had to support them. Some of them are viable in the long run, some of them are not. You have this trade-off. In the short run, you have this trade-off between reallocation and protection. But in the longer term, you have this issue of how do you regain control of value chains, how you enhance the innovation ecosystem in Europe. And you see, that's what COVID, those are the issues that COVID raised. The climate is a different type. It's more realizing, it's the shock has not come in one go. It has not been the same kind of, it's not a shock like COVID is. What is the shock is that now we realize that gradual policies are not enough if we want to meet the challenge of 55% reduction in CO2 emission by 2030. We need to say no more combustion engine in Paris within 10 years or 20 years. We need to say, so there is the realization that to achieve some targets, gradual measures, policies are no longer sufficient, and you need to move to very drastic policies that also entail creative destruction. You see, but they are very different kind. And so what they call for is that you need to deal, you have several issues, because creative destruction means that you need also to have an ecosystem for new entry and growth of firms. And what Thomas showed is that in the US, the creative destruction has been stalled by superstar firms that took advantage of loopholes in competition policy and competition rules in the US to become hegemonic and to stifle innovation and entry by other firms. So in the US, there is, of course, the big issue of adapting competition policy to the digital era, to make sure that when you allow for a merger and acquisition, you look at the effect it could have on subsequent entry and innovation, which we have done insufficiently also in Europe, and to have other things on competition policy to adapt it to the digital era, to make sure that you can have. So it's important that if you want to, you have those two shocks, those two things show the importance of creative destruction. But for that to work, you need entry and growth of firms. So anything that inhibits entry and growth of firms needs to be addressed. In the US, what inhibits the entry and growth of firms is a lot the inappropriate competition policy and excessive lobbying. Those are the kind of culprits. In Europe, it's also, I think we have the chance to have the competition, commissioner, Mrs. Vestager, is doing a very good job. And I think we have the chance to have that. But still also in Europe, I think there is a bit old-fashioned competition policy, very much based on market share and market definition that needs to be a bit modernized. But in Europe, the first order problem is that we don't have, for example, in France in particular, we don't have the ecosystem. I mean, only in the biotech in the US, you have for basic research, you have the NSF, you have the NIH, you have the Howard Hughes Medical Institute. All that is to just finance basic research. You have very well developed venture capital. In France, very badly, you have institutional investors. In France, very little. And you have the Barda. So you have all these instruments of innovation, starting from basic research, you see, to all the way to industrialization, which you have in the US, which you don't have in France. I mean, I spent 20 years of my life in Boston. I met several French consulates, you know, the Consul de France at Boston. And they told me always that their main job was to welcome French startups that could not grow in France and that needed to come to the US to find venture capital, So you see that the common point is that both in the US and France and Europe, you have insufficient now creative destruction, but for different reasons. In the US, first order is the Thomas problem, is the competition problem. I would say that in Europe, you could improve still on competition policy, but first order is an inadequate ecosystem for basic research and for letting startups grow and grow in Europe. And I would say that that's crucial if you want creative destruction to operate. Sorry, for being a bit long there.
No, but that's a very good transition, because that's the question I wanted to ask Thomas, to bounce back on this idea of which policy do you need to strike the right balance and maybe clinch on the trade-offs between creation and destruction. Which policy interventions do you need? Does it depend on the context? Philippe gave his view on US versus Europe. One key example is what happens with data and policy and monopoly power on data management, data valuation, and data sales. So I have in mind the fact that Google is now going to not accept cookies or not deal with cookies anymore, which de facto will close its own universe and privatize the value of the data that is being created by the traffic on Google. But more generally, and coming back to our topic, Thomas, what do you think about this policy trade-off and adequate policies that need to be adopted in front of this situation?
So I think it's a bit different for COVID and for climate. I think I'm more optimistic for COVID, post-COVID policies for climate. I mean, one lesson for COVID is that if the shock is big and the countries act boldly, then we can do a lot, actually. We can really change the way we can change a lot of things that we didn't think we could change so easily. We can change the way we work, we can change the way we travel, we can have vast expansion of safety nets for firms, for people, and more importantly, probably, at least in a global sense, we can create vaccine in less than 12 months. So that's amazing. I think that at the end of the day, if we look back at the way globally we reacted to COVID, there's going to be a lot of things that are not great, but the big picture is that we did much better than I think if anybody would have thought possible. So I think so the fact that people know that means that funding for a new type of vaccine for whatever the next COVID is going to be, I don't think that's going to be an issue, either public or private. So my sense is that the question is going to be more the traditional one of, where are the vaccines going to be developed? What kind of supply chain? How do you make sure they are resilient? But these are all fixable problems. I don't see a big policy failure. Now, climate is different. Because climate, we are late. The train has left the station. And And we are still very far from having a meaningful pricing of carbon around the world. And we still give massive subsidies to fossil fuel industries. So, and there's no appetite politically to do. I mean, there's a lot of greenwashing and a lot of posturing, but actually, if you look at what's being done, it's not that much. The bright light, of course, again, is innovation. To some extent, we've made more progress in some areas than we thought maybe 5 years ago, but it's not up to the, I think it's not up to the task. And to some extent, also the issue is that the free riding problem is much worse even than for COVID, because at the end of the day, the vaccine has two dimensions. It protects you and it protects the others. Okay, so because it protects the other, that means it's going to be undersupplied and under demanded. But still, it does protect you. So if you do something, you're going to maybe, in the case of COVID, you got to think of, okay, you get 50% of the benefit by doing the right thing. Okay, so you need to you have a free rider problem of 50%. But for climate, it's 100%. What you do is literally irrelevant. In fact, even to a level that it's true for the whole country. What France does for climate change is utterly irrelevant because it will have zero impact on global emission or global anything. So the risk of free riding is much worse, and the politics is much worse. In the US, right now we have a majority of people in Congress who believe in climate change, but there's a very high chance that's going to change next year. So for climate, I think that I'm much more pessimistic that we're going to do the right thing at the right time. And I think, therefore, that the right approach is to try anything that can stick. So let's give you one example. In a first best world, in a second best world, probably in a third best world, it would still be true that central banks would not really get involved in climate change. I mean, it's not really their mandate, and whatever they can do, you can probably do it better with fiscal instruments. But that's in a third best world. I think we're in a 10th best world, and in that world, I want central banks to do everything they can. And that goes with the private sector as well. I mean, given that the government are going to be awfully behind what we should be doing, I think we need private sector help as much as possible. And hopefully, if we try everything, maybe we're going to get somewhere. But I'm not as optimistic as I am for pandemic risk.
That's a clear message. I was planning to ask you something else, Şebnem, but if you want to react on this, because that's a very key discussion, and if you have time afterwards, come back on the on SME development.
Right. Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. I mean, let me first clarify. I didn't talk about climate and creative destruction in my original opening because I want to make sure we are clear on the COVID and SMEs, because it is a super good example for climate and creative destruction. Let me explain. I mean, Thomas is right, of course. I mean, COVID and the next pandemic, we can fix these issues. But the reason why is because there is willingness, because it is so immediate and so urgent, right? It's just so short run. I mean, you fix it or otherwise you die, right? So this is the problem with climate. Why we were late? Because it wasn't immediate, it wasn't obvious to everyone, and there was no private return. So you want private sector invest in climate like all the past 20 years? Why would they? I mean, there is no return to them. So climate is all about social return, and firms just didn't care about it, and governments didn't do enough. And that's exactly what when Philippe said there wasn't enough investment in this. Yes, because governments also didn't care. And this goes back to the point Thomas made. They didn't care, and they kept doing large subsidies to the polluters. Okay, now we are in this moment that we learned two things. First, this is also immediate. Maybe not, people dying now, but it is right there. We see with the floods, we see with the fires, and it is right there. That's what we realize. Number two, we also realize we can do things very quickly. I mean, Thomas said that. We developed a vaccine in 12 months. We realize fiscal policy can do wonders, right? Governments can do wonders, right? I mean, forget the private sector, forget to incentivize the private sector. Governments can do this. That's what we realize. This is why COVID is very important. COVID taught us two things. In something like this, we can act quickly, and governments can do a lot. Now, in climate, of course, this is global, right? I mean, just US government is doing something, just France is doing something is not going to work. It has to be global. But given the also immediate nature of this climate issue, I think we should definitely push the governments to do more, and governments also realizing they can do more. And I think this is something that just all of us have a responsibility, and we should push further. And here I think a critical thing is always like looking at this from a perspective of, oh, this is just a social return. This is it is this, we have to also clarify. There's also a private return to this. And here now the SME point comes back. Innovation is going to be a key part of this, right? I mean, if we really go at this problem with innovative solutions, then governments are going to be also on board and realizing the immediate nature of the problem, and innovation can solve this problem is going to just catalyze the whole thing. Now, here I think it is super important to understand, again, I'm going to come back to finance and SMEs, right? Both Philippe and Thomas told us creative destruction wasn't already working before COVID, before climate change. I mean, like, we have this process stop, right? Different reasons. US, the competition, Europe, other reasons. Emerging market is worse. I mean, because the competition is going to be worse, corruption is going to be worse. So we enter, the COVID and general the climate change problem already where the creative destruction doesn't work as it should. Okay, so we know that. And now we also know that innovative firms are the small firms, and these guys are the ones that can bring a lot of solutions to the table in terms of quick solutions for the climate change. I mean, the vaccine is found by two Turks and a small company in Germany, right? Yes, Pfizer made it global, but literally the discovery is by the two Turks in BioNTech in Germany. So same is going to be true for climate. There are going to be many, many small firms, right? And they are going to have innovative solutions, but these firms are unfortunately not financed. And we talk about venture capital financing. This is ridiculous. I mean, the extent of venture capital financing. I mean, Europe, it is known. Even the US, I mean, when you match the venture capital finance firms to census firms, you have a drop in this. So venture capital finance is not going to stop. Okay? So governments are not subsidizing these firms. So we should actually, I fully agree with Thomas, governments should stop giving these large subsidies to large firms. And then they should do it small firms, but this is very political. This is not going to happen overnight, right? So market finance is going to be very important here, right? I mean, markets has to come to the point that there is a private return to this. These small innovative firms needs to be financed at the expense of large incumbents who are benefiting from these government subsidies. And if you look at actually the data, the big problem there is exactly the size of these firms. These firms don't have collateral. When they go to a bank, with some sort of green innovation, they don't get the money. These firms borrow showing things like their account receivables. So they have to be profitable firms. That's why they don't get it. And we look at this issue in a separate paper using very representative data sets from US SMEs, actually, and looking exactly at these sectors. And unfortunately, banks don't finance these firms. So we have to attack this problem both angles. Right? The government definitely should be involved. That's no question. But given the political dimension of the issue, we have to really bring the market finance. These firms are not going to be in the bond or the stock markets. They don't issue bonds. They are not in the stock market, right? So these firms really rely on the bank finance, and banks don't finance them because these firms don't have collateral. So I think it is very important that somehow we change the rules of the game there. I mean, one thing we learned again from the COVID. COVID is actually, and the policy response to COVID is actually work for creative destruction. Why? Because yes, when I said policies on target, the policies on target in the sense that they didn't find the viable firm and the zombie firm and literally did that type of surgery, but they did target it to smaller firms, to poorer people, right? At least there's some of that. And in that sense, it did work for the creative destruction in that sense, right? I mean, instead of trying to keep alive the airlines and the GMs of Europe, they said, like, let me go and really try to help these SMEs. So we learned this with COVID. We can do the same thing with the climate. And when those market finance companies start, if you look at SMEs in Europe, I mean, they went to bank, they didn't get the money. They didn't get the money to cover the revenue shortfall. They didn't. I mean, this is they are asking for the revenue shortfall, nothing to do with the viability. It's complete. The customers are not coming, and they couldn't borrow this from the bank, right? How it did work when the government told the bank, I'm going to subsidize you. Right? This is what we call an equity-like injection. I'm going to take 90% of this, you go and give the loan. And that's when the loan started. And in fact, in order to avoid this delay, Northern European countries gave the money directly through the tax system, right? So that they avoid the banks. Because banks don't want to do it. Why? Because it is risky, this is not profitable. We have to revert this. We have to make sure investing in climate change innovation, these SMEs, there is a return to this, and bank, if it takes to subsidize the bank by governments, then that's what we should do. But that's how we're going to solve this problem. And in that sense, I think COVID is a great lesson here on the table. Thank you.
Can I add something
Yes.
Can I just say something about what Şebnem said, Natacha? Quickly?
Of course, I was going to give you the floor.
A very important point. There used to be the view, it's about competition and industrial policy, actually. It's very related to that. There was a debate, at the very, particularly at the time of the transition in Eastern Europe. It was the time, of what we call the Washington Consensus days, and it was a view very much pushed by Anne Kruger, for example, when she was number 2 of the IMF, with the view that industrial policy is always against competition. So if you believe in competition, and we do believe in competition, we believe in the virtue of competition. I mean, Thomas, Şebnem, myself, we believe very much that competition is key to innovative economy where creative destruction plays a big role. But in the name of competition, of being pro-competition, some people at the time denounced any form of industrial policy because they said it would be against competition. You see what I mean? There was this view that any form of top-down policy would be necessarily against competition. And in fact, what the vaccine shows is that if you DARPA, the DARPA way, but that applies to some technology. You cannot DARPA everything. But in the area of defense or in the area of energy, you have the ARPA energy, or in the area of biotech with BARDA. In these areas, you can have a smart industrial policy where you have a mixture of top-down and bottom-up. And what's exactly what Şebnem described. What happened with DARPA or BARDA is that you have the money coming from the ministry, but then they name team leaders, and the team leaders have full latitude to elicit many competing projects from new firms. And so you reconcile, you have some top-down part, but which doesn't go against creative destruction and competition, but which goes in favor of creative destruction and competition. And that's what's very interesting with the DARPA type of model, or the BARDA, you see, is that it's a type of sectoral policy, you could say, if you don't like the word industrial, which is not against creative destruction, which is not against competition. If you have good governance, you see, it goes in the way of fostering it. And that's very interesting because there was a view, it's true, you have some pitfalls of industrial policy post-war, indeed, where in France in particular, until up to these days, where industrial policy is synonymous of helping, the state helping particular firms, champions and all that. That's very bad, we don't want that. But there is another way of having state involvement, even vertically, which is of the DARPA type, and the DARPA allows to be top-down first, but it has a lot of bottom-up in it, which fosters competition, creativity, structure. Şebnem, am I betraying what you were saying or not?
Yes, I fully agree with Philippe.
You agree with that? Okay.
That's, what it makes me think that this will be music to the ears of our friends from the European Investment Bank and EIF who are in the audience. I saw them. So Christophe, Helmut, Laurent, maybe others. I know you're working on the next annual report, so this discussion could feed into the report, and that would be a very good policy recommendation. Maybe, Thomas, do you want to add something on this discussion, or we move to the questions from the floor? We don't hear you.
No, I think we can move to the question from the floor. I agree with what Philippe and Şebnem said.
Okay, perfect. So we have a few questions. There are 2 sets of questions so far. You can feel free to ask more. The first one is on the getting back to the involvement of central banks. Thomas has been very, very careful because he speaks about a 10th best world. But the question is, what should be the involvement of central banks in the fight against the risks determined by climate change? Should they respect their actual mandate or extend it due to the actual situation in regards to climate? So that's the first question. We could go a quick round on this, and then I'll come back to other questions that are more related to the changes in the way we work and live with COVID. But we could go reverse order. Thomas, you're big on my screen, so if you want to start.
Yeah, no, so what I meant to say was that if you think about what central banks can do on climate, it's really about pricing correctly. climate, the risk and the value of avoiding the risk. Now, in an ideal world, you could imagine that this could be done in many different ways, and it's not obvious it would have to be done by the central bank. It could be done by some other, it could be done by the government, so as not perhaps to create some confusion in the mandate. But I don't think that's the world we live in. I think that if we want to have a meaningful impact on the pricing of carbon and climate risk, you need all hands on the deck. And in particular, I think the central banks have a very powerful role to play in the pricing of climate risk and in the pricing of carbon, without actually deviating from their mandate. So start from the obvious risk, it's a risk. It has a big impact on the value of the balance sheet. So obviously it belongs in stress testing. I mean, I don't think that's even like a discussion. Now, the central banks hold very large portfolios, especially with QE. Well, they should tilt the portfolio in a sense that reflect the value of various types of bonds with respect to emissions of carbon. They should be explicit about that, but the central bank should not be holding the average portfolio. They should tilt their portfolio towards more green, less brown. I think that asset managers have done that for a long time, so it's not as if it's not rocket science, But I think that would have a big impact on the pricing. And again, because my view is that we are late. So I think that to catch up, we need to have all the possible signals, and market prices are a great signal in that sense. They also have, there's some feature of this, which is, it's not a free lunch, but it has a multiple equilibrium flavor to it. So it's not a free lunch in the sense of the whatever it takes Draghi speech, but it is a little bit in the sense that if you manage to get the price signal right, so that if people believe that in 20 years this thing is going to be priced correctly, they're going to start acting today. So if they believe that some technologies are going to be forbidden because they pollute too much, or that the price of carbon is going to be high at some point in the near future, they're going to start acting today to change their technology and adapt and provide solutions. If they actually do that, when the time comes, it's going to be much easier to make the transition, and therefore it would be politically much easier to actually price the carbon high. And so this self-fulfilling feature means that the central bank announcing that they will tilt their portfolio towards green, holding green bonds. And that actually can happen without much disruption in equilibrium, because the market is going to adapt to that. Okay, I don't think it's the full multiple equilibrium the way it was for short-term debt and the risk of leaving the eurozone that worked under the whatever it takes. But it was almost like a textbook multiple equilibrium story where in equilibrium the cost was zero. I don't think it's the case here, but it still has a pretty good multiplier. So I would definitely be in favor of that.
A consequence of what you say is that the transition period, so the time horizon at which markets anticipate the right price matters. It needs to be long enough so as not to destroy too much capital too quickly. And a question would be, but you won't have time to answer because I will give the floor to Şebnem, is how do you price, the sovereign bonds? And you can select, you can bias your portfolio accordingly for bonds issued by the private sector. But we have an issue with how to categorize the sovereign bonds in these metrics. So Şebnem, if you want to say a word on central banks.
I think overall I agree with Thomas that central banks, they will have a role in this, and they should have a role in this. We are late, and we should definitely attack the problem on all fronts. I agree with that. But at the same time, it is extremely hard for central banks. I mean, central banks have to be extremely clear in their communication, right? We know that. And with dual mandate, like US and other central banks, even with a single mandate, the minute you start a communication, targeting certain sectors and all that, and it can get complicated, right? And markets cannot afford a tiny bit of complicated message. So in that sense, I think this is something that central banks should be very clear about. But in terms of prices, they can, of course, do a lot, right? In terms of maybe thinking about setting the relative price rate. And in fact, there was a very interesting paper by Veronica Guerreri, Ivan Werning, and Ludwig Straub, this year's Jackson Hole. The paper presented right after Chairman Powell's speech, and this was one of their points, right? In a world, again, of course, there's a COVID shock here, but in a world where a supply shock includes demand shock and Keynesian unemployment, the point Philip raised before, central banks should get the relative prices right. Again, a lesson we learned from COVID can be applied to climate. And there, since we know this has to be global, not just one central bank do it, I think there's a role here for US central bank, because we know that US monetary policy and US central bank has a global footprint. This was something shown in Helen Ray's work, my 2019 Jackson Hole paper. So in that sense, if central banks get the relative price right and their influence on risk premia, especially US Federal Reserve, they can have a large impact on this.
That's clear. Thank you. Philippe, on this topic, and I had one question for you, which was targeted to you, so that you can answer both, maybe.
Because on central banks, I have nothing to add. Thomas and Şebnem and yourself, actually, you're very modest, Natacha. You were at the ECB and you are involved in this green finance, and so you're being too shy. No, I will not add anything to what was very well explained by me.
So that's thanks for the transition, because I have a question for you. I don't follow the chronological order of questions, but since you have the floor, Sylvain is asking, is saying that European SMEs have rebalanced the way they finance themselves in the past decade with more equity relative to debt. Do you think this has had a positive impact on their ability to innovate? Or is this equity gap still too large for European SMEs?
Well, I speak under the control of Şebnem and Thomas there. Yeah. My own feeling is that much more needs to be done. I mean, I can see venture capital has developed in France, but it's not at all of the same magnitude as it is in the US. Even the venture capitalists are very different animals. In the US, typically venture capitalists are people who have been successful startup firms that grew, did an IPO and became venture capital, and then they advise new firms, and the venture capital in the US, I want to be right, I mean, institutional investors help, the fact that you have developed institutional investment also helps having a more developed venture capital system in the US. We lack that a lot in Europe because we have insufficient venture capital or institutional investment. It's due also to the fact that in France, for example, we don't have a capitalization system for pensions, and I'm not in favor of moving all the way to capitalization system, but oh my God, there is one. But it's true that we are still, way below what we can offer. We see many firms, and you could see with Pfizer. I mean, why is it that they needed to go to the US to develop the vaccine fully? I mean, those were guys in the Germany or in the Turk and Hungarian researchers. Why did they need to get US financing? I mean, you didn't have. So I have the feeling that still, if you were to represent, the kind of Pete Clino curve, age firm size, if you represent, we have the certain slope of the line in the US, which is pretty steepy. If you represent the average Europe, I bet you would be much flatter than what you have in the US. I don't have the curve exactly. I think at some point we did, but you can see, obviously, it's easier to grow in the US than it is in, of course, with all the barriers that Thomas mentioned and which are there. But still, I have the feeling that there is move in the right direction. Now, for example, in France, we have more startups than we used to have, but still, we still have, growth of firms is not at all in France what it is. You can see the size distribution of firms by age. You can see that. You can compare France and the US. I did that for a study on productivity growth and the measurement productivity growth in France versus US. You have much less. It looks very different. You have you have much less large firms or firms growing large in France than you have in the US. I could show you I don't have the graphs there, but the differences are significant.
But let me add something to this, because this is very important, and this is my basically life's work.
Yeah.
2 decades. This is a false narrative. There is no such thing as SMEs are equity finance. And forget Europe. It is not the case in US. And let me first make this very clear. This sense comes from these bits of data we look, because for the universe of firms like census data, we don't know the financing of the firms. So people are always too quick to go and look at some venture capital finance firms. Some firms raise equity there. Some firms like issuing the bond, and then says, oh, look, this is on the rise, this is on the rise, equity is on the rise, market. This is not true. You get the universe of SMEs from a representative census data. You go get their financing. It is overwhelmingly bank finance or just family finance, right? You
earnings.
That's it. I mean, like, this is going to be a very tiny bit of the firms, equity finance. Very little of the SMEs are listed in the stock exchange. So we really have to correct this false narrative. Unfortunately, for many, many, many years, because of the lack of data, this false narrative made a deep place in academic literature, in policy literature. We really have to work at correcting this. Yes, there should be more. I mean, exactly as Philip said, but we are not there. So unfortunately, SMEs are still bank reliant, a lot in Europe. And ESRB has a very new report that is showing this. Overwhelmingly, corporate debt is in bank loans, around like 75, 80%. The corporate debt, entire corporate debt. So this will also tell you how small bond markets are. Forget equity. In US, look at my new paper I presented at the NBR Summer Institute EFG group. Very, very little. Because why? We didn't know anything about US SMEs before. Why? The entire firm financing literature will compute that data. Average size in a compute that firm is 3,000 employees. This is not an SME. SME size is less than 500 employees in US, less than 250 employees in Europe, but they account for the real economy. This is why we have the disconnect. Every crisis after crisis, we have Wall Street going off the roof and unemployment going off the charts. Why? Because these are completely disconnected for us. So it's very important that we correct this, because otherwise we are not going to move forward in terms of the policy recommendations. Thank you.
I don't want to leave the topic because it's so heated, but I have a lot of questions to get through. Can we move to productivity and the way we started to work with COVID? I summarized 2 questions. Does it increase or decrease labor productivity? The loss of personal interaction, good or bad for productivity? The possibility for new global teams, does it compensate more than compensate the drawbacks? And the breakthrough of teleconferencing, all those elements with an element of example of Alitalia. What do you think about it? What's your view on those evolutions? I think, Thomas, it's your turn to take the word, but please, anyone feel free to start.
Specifically on working from home, I think that, well, it has to increase productivity because you just increase the opportunity set. So it's just pushing the frontier. Again, what we've discovered is that it works. And I think the thing that was striking with COVID is that there was clearly a coordination problem. So nothing that we're using today is new. So the fact that it was not adopted on a large scale was clearly, at least in part, due to a coordination problem. And now a big shock, standard textbook math, a big shock can help solve a coordination problem. So that's what happened with COVID. We had no choice. We had to switch, and then realize actually it works pretty well. So for sure, it's absolutely clear it's going to increase productivity just mechanically because we just push the frontier. Now, could it increase it a lot or not? That I think we don't know yet. What I find always striking in the data there is if you ask people have remarkably similar preferences. So, the vast majority of people are in the 3-2 or 2-3 camp. And that's true around the world, actually. Most people want to spend 3 days in the office, 2 days at home, or 2-3. Nobody wants to do 0-0-5 or 5-0, or very few people, I mean. And so, in fact, it's actually remarkably consistent, which tells me that I would think that we're going to move towards a system like 3+2 or 4+1. I would think it would be like the norm. And then I think the other thing is, can we use this technology to avoid linking to climate change? I mean, clearly, hopefully, we can do more things remotely, so we spend less energy moving people around when we don't need to, like a conference like that. So I think that's going to be good. That's going to be saving of energy. Beyond that, I don't know. I think the big breakthroughs, it's always hard to know in advance. Like, we always tend to overestimate the short-term impact and underestimate the long-term impact. To me, the big breakthrough are like in personal services. So the one I would really like to see is telemedicine, because that's also something where there was a huge barrier to coordination. It was just, not well accepted to see your doctor on Zoom or on secured Zoom. I think it's becoming more accepted. And if you think about something that could actually really increase productivity in the sector that matters, I think that would be one of them. So that's the one I find most important.
Thank you. Philippe, you want to
yes,
say
I was looking at notes where I presented you. There was a very, you might have seen the work by Bloom and co-authors, on the survey that they have on working from home, and what's very interesting is is the self-assessment. So in fact, it's interesting to see where the gains come from, and it looks like the productivity gains are, self-assessment and less commuting. It seems that that will in itself induce substantial gains. And what's very interesting is that those gains are, what they claim is that are highest, but they're uneven. They're highest among employees from city offices, and that will be that will be good. And they talk about this. It will enhance home values in suburbs, reduce, of course, rental rates in city centers. It's very interesting. They try to identify in their work the sources of productivity increase, where it will come from. The view is that working from home, of course, increases productivity, but unevenly, and they try to identify the sources of productivity increase, and also which population will be more, concerned by this productivity increase, and I think that's a very interesting, area. I have personally nothing to add much to to this analysis that Bloom et al. Have done, which I find absolutely fascinating, and I think. But what it has in common with all our discussion on creative destruction is again about unevenness. It doesn't affect all segments, rural, urban, skilled, non-skilled population the same way, and it's very important to understand, the extent and nature of the unevenness in productivity increase that will be induced by the working from home trend.
Thank you. Şebnem, on this topic, just one remark. We have 15 minutes left, and there are quite a few questions on the chat. So if you three identify a question that you would like to answer like that I didn't spot, feel free to. But Şebnem, maybe a word on this topic of productivity and work.
Yeah, I fully agree. I have nothing to add over Thomas and Philippe on this. I fully agree with what they said.
Okay, thank you. So I'll pick the question by Oleg. How should we change the political system to prioritize social benefit and conditions for SMEs, as opposed to interests of big firms and wealthy individuals? And how can this be achieved? So we move more to the political front of the topic. Who wants to start? Time to think. Şebnem?
But I think it's a bit different in the US. Oh, sorry, Sam, do you want to go?
Thomas, go ahead.
Oh, so I think it's a bit different in the US and in Europe. I think in the US, most of the issue have to do with campaign finance. That's where the big inequality is. So, one way to think about it is, we all know if you plot the size distribution of firms, it's very skewed. Okay, so that means that large firms are account for a large fraction of total sales output. But then if you look at the distribution of political donations, and campaign finance contribution, it's like an order of magnitude more skewed. That is, even among the big firms, it's the really, really big ones who make the bulk of. So then if you think that political influence is linked, increasing in the amount of money you give to politics, it doesn't have to be proportional, just like vaguely increasing, then clearly that's telling you that these guys have much more political power. So I think for the US, the priority should be something that would limit their influence in campaign finance contribution. I think in Europe, we start from a quite different perspective. I think in Europe, the way I think about the inequality is, Air France got 7 billion of loans from the French government. It was not really discussed.
I don't want to mention it, but thank you for mentioning it.
We have a system that's state aid rules, but of course during COVID it's suspended, and then you let the states, which I think Europe was right to do, which is during a massive issue like COVID, then at the EU level we relax the rule, but then if you look at what states do is once you relax the rule, it doesn't make you very optimistic, So was that the wisest way to spend taxpayer money? I think it's a joke. So that means that I think still in Europe, the one way to balance the power of companies is still at the EU level to make sure that the EU institutions work well, because they are not perfect, far from it. But in terms of the balance of power, I think they are more independent from big firms than national governments. So in this thing, I would tend to trust. So that would be my way to think about it in Europe.
Interesting. Şebnem or
yeah, so this is a very difficult issue, right? This is the holy grail. I fully agree with what Thomas said, but let me tell you, I think this is an issue in every country. In US, it is very visible in campaign contributions. That you can see it because this data out there. I think it is seen in Europe and emerging markets. Emerging markets, just large companies have huge political power. There's no such thing as a campaign contribution, but it is there. And in Europe, I think it is also there in a hidden way. So maybe Europe is the best. I don't know, because there's also very strict regulation in Europe. But this is a problem for everyone. Maybe it is a lot in the US and it's very visible in the US, but I think it is a large firm's political power is a global problem, which is of course one of the key things that works against climate, fixing the climate change problem, right? So I think we have to somehow find a way of getting the incentives right and getting the market work here, because this is not a problem you can solve overnight. Even you solve the campaign contribution problem, these firms are going to have clout. As the Air France example, as the COVID example, right? So I think what we saw is, this is different from country to country, but at least during COVID, governments had the strength to say, okay, large firms, you're on your own because you can go to your credit lines, go to your banks, you will be fine. I'm going to go and spend more on the small firms. At least we've seen that this is possible, right? So maybe that's one way to go, like try to use finance in a creative way that we cannot solve the political problem overnight. The other issue here is I fully agree with Thomas. Yes, when I say during COVID policies work, but there was huge waste. These, because they were untargeted. If you look at our fiscal multipliers in our paper, huge. The money really wasted. In fact, a lot of money went to firms who didn't need it, who could have survived COVID, because the governments didn't have time to find, oh, that restaurant is viable, that is not viable. They didn't have time to do that. So a lot of money wasted here. So, but at the same time, I think it has to be a combination of the two. Somehow, I don't think we can decrease the political power of large firms on governments overnight. There are different ways of doing it. You can do it in the corrupt way in emerging markets, through the campaign stuff in US, and different ways in Europe. But the argument was like, oh, we have to save the airline because otherwise we are doomed. There's no good economic argument to save any big airline, but still, European governments do it too. So you can do it legally too. Large firms can have power on governments through different means. So in that sense, I think this is not something we can solve overnight. We have to come up with creative solutions. And we have to somehow make the market finance and government subsidies work together in conjunction in a synergy way to go around this problem. But it's not something that I think we can fix overnight just with doing more and more regulation, because they are not. If it's not going to enforce, there's no point of doing regulation, right? So I think it is a huge problem, and we need all minds on deck to solve this problem for sure.
So I think I am totally in agreement with what Thomas and Şebnem said. I mean, I go back to my triangle. I mean, it's true that the state, the governments of the state have a series of instruments, fiscal, competition policy, the rules to finance political campaigns. It's true, for example, when in the US, under Scalia, the Supreme Court removed any limit on the amount that private firms could give to politicians. That was not going in the right direction. The work of Trebi and Bombardini on lobbying, and so I think competition policy, rules to finance political campaigns, lobbying regulation, all those are tools that are important. Then you can say what guarantees that the executive power will do it, and then you could say to some extent separation of power, that you have a judiciary, but we also know that that doesn't work so well on its own, because the constitution is an incomplete contract, and because the constitution is an incomplete contract, that's why you need civil society to make sure you enforce the incomplete contract. And I go back to my triangle. You need the state and you need civil society. As you know, after the Civil War in the US, there was the 15th Amendment that was introduced that would give voting rights to African Americans. But of course, southern states in the US didn't enforce it. They had the poll tax and the literacy test that would make it impossible at the end for African Americans to vote. And it took the civil rights movement to then get the amendment of 1965, the rule of the Supreme Court in 1965, the Voting Act, that made it really, that forbade the literacy test and the poll tax restrictions, you see, and really disenfranchised the African American, the African American. So you see, you always have civil society is crucial to make sure. You see, for example, the Constitution of Colombia. Colombia is a country in Latin America. They have the same constitution as France. But when you are a union leader in Colombia, you have a very high probability of being killed. Not in France yet, you see, because in France you have civil society that is there to enforce the contract. In Colombia, it's the same constitution, but it means nothing because you don't have the civil society to enforce the contract. So the triangle is absolutely key. And if now you have a change in competition policy in the US because you had voters that express itself, and many voters, there is now a whole thing that, some people want to restrict the voting in the US but to not get back the same results as last time. But it was crucial, that vote, to make competition policy change in the US. And that was civil society again. So I think, I think this is key, because you can have all the policy tools that you want. You can have the formal separation of power that you want. But without the civil society there, it will not be enforced.
That's the empowerment of civil society. That's a very strong message you're sending us today, Philippe.
Yeah, but that's my old militant years, that speak out.
No, but it's maybe a good time to bring it forward. We have 5 minutes left. Ernest will say a few concluding words, but maybe if you promise to have a 1 minute slot each, I'll read one last question, which is kind of a good concluding question to all three. What will be the big shock that will solve the coordination problem for climate protection? Will this shock come too late due to the long lags of the positive effects of these measures? What do you think? So, prospective views.
I have to leave in 1 minute, actually. Unfortunately, I have to rush something else. Let me, if I can start. Again, I think we are very late on this, echoing what Thomas said, but I guess the big shock that will be like COVID, where it makes you to fix things so quickly, is like you see people burning on the streets. I mean, because it's so hot, I don't know, something like that, literally death is imminent. Then I think, we go and we really push this. I hope it doesn't come to that. I hope it's obvious enough now that this is a shock at the door and we are late. And we have the tools. I mean, we have the tools. We can bring all policy, government, private sector, civil society, as Philip said, to the table. We can definitely, not fully solve this issue because it already started, and clearly there are going to be scaring from this, but we can definitely slow it down and prevent the worst case scenario like that, like people literally dying on streets. So hopefully we will achieve that. That's my hope, and I'm optimistic.
Thank you.
Bye, Şebnem.
And bye if you have to leave.
Thanks for coming. Bye, Şebnem. All the best.
Thomas Philippe.
Thomas?
Well, in terms of shocking, like a shock that would actually have an impact on people, I think heat waves are the most likely, because I was struck. So this is not my like technical area of research, but I was struck by the heat wave we saw in the northeast of the US and Canada this summer was so huge that it actually, just one data point, this thing changed actually the calibration of the models, in the sense that, you know, with the calibration from say May or April, it was actually extremely unlikely to see something like that. The fact that it actually happened means that they've recalibrated, and now they think that this is by far the place where like an extreme heat wave is the thing that's going to be the most salient. So I think that's, but I also don't think it's going to be it's never going to be like a one shock like COVID. It's going to be a sequence. And if I have to put my optimism somewhere, it would be innovation. I mean, the day we find some kind of innovation where we can finally see that it can scale and have a meaningful impact on carbon emission, then I think that's when we're going to start to coordinate on that.
Yeah. Thank you, Thomas.
Yeah, I very much agree with what Thomas said. You know, my hope is that already what, you know, Vancouver and Western Germany went through will play a big role already. You know, that they say we got the big shock already and that we will act. I think there is hope that it's happening. But I agree with Thomas that it will take this combination of big shocks of that kind and big breakthroughs in innovation. For example, the fusion technology, I think there's been some progress recently that you know, people should, you know, that I think they are very interesting. And I think that's right. I believe in the combination of the two. I believe also in another thing, you know, there are other countries that want to develop. It would be very interesting. I'm doing some work now with Fabrizio Zilibotti, Michael Peters, and Timo Boppart, where we look at, you know, what we call structural change. You know, economies go from agriculture to industry and then services. If you can bypass mass industrialization, that would reduce a lot the amount of CO2 emission. So you shouldn't deny to nobody the right to develop. But it would be great if maybe through international trade, through, you know, we could allow other countries that also would want to develop as the way India and China did, but say, well, let's do it, but moving quicker to services. And that would have a huge impact because the fear is that if we don't achieve that, we will increase CO2 emission even more. So and it's very hard to tell countries don't stop developing because we want you and we deny you the right to do what we did. So anything that can be done, and so for example, protectionist policy vis-a-vis these countries can be very counterproductive because it might slow down their transition towards services. So we have to take that into account now in the way we think about international trade, the relation North-South. All that should be rethought in light of the objective of achieving quickly, you know, the objectives. Reduction.
Thank you, Philippe. Ernest, that's a topic for our next webinar. I give you the floor and thank you very much, the three of you. Şebnem is not there anymore, but thanks again for taking the time. That was a very lively.
Thank you for inviting us. Yes. Thank you so much. Thank you, Natacha. You did a great job, and Ernest and Thomas, it was a pleasure to interact with you.
This concludes our seminar. Let me thank all of you for sharing your insights today with us, and all of you for joining for the discussion. Bye-bye and take care.
Bye. Au revoir, Natacha. Bye, Ernest. All the best. Bye-bye. Thanks so much for inviting me.